Hello and welcome to the sixth video of my Pygame tutorial. Now, if you remember, what we wanted to do this time is kind of rearrange things so it's a little bit nicer just to work with. Now, to start, I've already gone ahead and created this testing folder. This is just to keep things organized so you guys don't get confusing. Of course, if you have an environment like this, then you're not going to have the testing folder. This is just where I have my example test, pre-testing, and the example. So I'll show you what we're going to look at doing today after we rearrange our code, or possibly all of it bleeding in. I'm not sure if we'll get exactly to every process here just yet. So what I've got is my standard box. Of course, the example, it moves slower. And if you saw, that red box, when it hit me, disappeared. I'm going to do that again. And that one disappeared. So I'll just run this again to show you what happens now if we decide to shoot instead. Now the bullet disappeared. So normally bullets will just fly away, but if I actually hit the box with it, they collide and destroy each other. So I'm not sure we'll get to the collisions just yet this time, but we will get to the enemies, as well as getting the enemies just kind of some basic tracking on us so that they follow us, which you can see from the other example. And we'll work on that after we get the code a little more organized. So let's start with this. Now, when we're programming, we don't want to have to, scroll up and down super excessively just to find, okay, we want somewhere, in the player. Let's try and find that. It's like 80 lines of code. We have to find the exact line we're looking for out of already almost 200 lines of code, 150-ish. So we want this to be a little bit better organized. To do that, I'm actually going to create some new files in my project folder. So I'm going to say new. We're going to go Python file, and what are we going to call this? Well, let's call it a generic player. And what is generic player going to be? Well, we have this thing called player active, and we'll make it this. So I'm just going to select everything here. Let's see. There we go. For some reason, that's not highlighting, unless I go to the next line. Anyway. So I'm going to just remove all of that from the main file, and we're going to put it over here. So now our entire player is in this one class. Now, here are a few problems. First off, you'll notice we don't have Pygame over here, so we're not too sure what this is supposed to be. We don't have colors over here, and we don't have this thing called bullet. So there are a few errors we get from moving this. Now, I'm thinking the best way to start with this is to get rid of these errors. So in this file here, generic player, we don't have Pygame imported. We don't have basically this statement or even this statement, import Pygame. So when we say pygame.surface, this is like, I don't know what Pygame is. So how might we fix that? Well, this shouldn't be too much of an issue to just import Pygame again, and then possibly even just say pygame.init, and then we initialize Pygame. This is actually perfectly safe to call wherever you want. It really doesn't matter, and this resolves the issue. So this is one way to do it, just saying that the generic player uses Pygame. Maybe we wanted to change its name to like generic Pygame player. Alternatively, when we set the thing's image, we can just send it a Pygame surface from over here. So let's scroll down a little bit. When we create the player right here, we could just say something like make it take an argument that is its actual shape. So we could just say something like pygame.surface of 100 by 100, and then we would force this argument to be set to up here basically. And that's one thing we can do. Since we're going to be using Pygame for more than just one thing in this module, and because bullets don't get called anywhere except right here, spawn ammo, we're actually going to leave it with, we're going to import Pygame here, just because I think that's going to be the easiest way to do this, and probably the simplest. So we've taken care of the Pygame problem. What about the color issue? Because we have a couple references to color, and currently there's no good data on it. Well, there are two ways we can deal with color, and I'm considering maybe going with one or the other. So the first way is the same idea. We just pass in a color, And then here, in our initialization statement, we say you're supposed to take a color, and then, we fill it with that color. And then we just pass it in the color of the object. So we force it to say what color it wants to be. And that's not a bad way of doing it. However, at the same time, if you consider that the player active is the only thing that uses the bullets, wouldn't it make sense to bring the bullets into that function as well, or into that file? So what I want to do ultimately is I also want this function, this class, to be moved over into the generic player, because the generic player is the only thing that needs to know what the bullet looks like. It needs to know the bullet's class definition. It's the only thing. And bullet, to get its image, uses something else. It uses getFont. Well, what is getFont? Well, getFont's this thing over in main called, right here, define getFont. But here's, again, the issue. We could, again, pass its image in when we create bullets. But if we were doing that, when we create bullets up here, spawn ammo, we would need to pass in the image here. And then in order to do that, we'd have to pass the image to the player. And that's where we're just kind of sending this image down way too far, because the image of the bullet has nothing to do with the player. There's no real reason for it to be there. So when we look at the bullet, how do we still get this image? We could move the getFont, but what if some other function in the future wants to use getFont as well? It's not the only thing that's going to be using this function. So for that, I'm going to create, yet again, another Pygame file, because I think I'm making this too complicated trying to explain all of this passing stuff. So what are we going to call this? I'm just going to call this utils. Now, I don't know if this is the best way of doing it, but I find that this way seems to work pretty well, at least with making things more simple and not crossing imports. And what I mean by crossing imports is we can't just say, so getFont is here, right? We can get font by doing something like this, import Pygame, then let's also import, the main function. That's completely valid. This is terrible though, because now main eventually will be importing the player, and then the player is importing main. This is an issue, if you can figure it out. So we don't want that. We don't want this thing to be dependent on main. Basically, main imports everything else that matters in this program, and nothing imports main. That is the major idea of it. So we don't want to be importing main. That's just kind of a bad idea. However, we have this other thing called utils. So what can we do with them? Well, let's move our function here, getFont. I'm just going to cut it there and paste it over here. And getFont is going to do the same thing. This one's going to use Pygame as well. And we're just going to make sure Pygame is initialized. So pygame.init. And then we're clear on this. This works. And now, over here, in our bullets class, we use getFont. Well, getFont is now part of utils. So if we just say utils.getFont, it'll work. But we haven't imported utils yet, so let's do that. Import utils, and that's just short for utilities. Now that we're importing utils, this file right here, then we can call utils.getFont, and it should be clear. There we go, utils.getFont. So we're looking in this file going, okay, what are we doing here? Well, we're going to grab this thing. Now if utils also holds all of our colors, for example, so say we wanted to move these, just keeping things clear. So utilities holds all of our colors. Now we don't have to do this weird pass by color thing for the player. So we don't need this anymore, because when it comes to a color, we can just say utils.blue. And then of course here, again, just utils.blue. And that's where we grab all of our colors from, just some kind of external library out there. And let's see, we just have randoms and math, I believe, until this class is completely clean. Yep, so let's make sure those are imported. Random and math. And now we should have no errors in this file. Oh, character list in black. Well, we know where we get the color, utils.black. Character list, since the class bullet is the only one that actually uses that character list, I have no issue moving that thing over. So we can just take this, remove it from this file, and send it over to this one. And I'm actually just going to put it right here. There we go. That should be all of the errors, I believe. So now player has the information on bullet since it's the only thing that creates it. And our main function is going to import player. So how do we import this? We don't need the bullet in the main function. We just need the player. So how might we do that? Well, it's not quite import. It's a little bit different. So all we really need is Pygame now. And now, in order to import a class versus importing a file, is we say from the generic player, we're going to import the player active class. So now this is going to only grab this one class, the player active class. That's the only thing it's going to grab from this file, because that's the only thing we need. There's no point importing everything if we don't need it. So let's see, all of this can be removed since we've cleaned this up quite a bit. And of course, we don't need to give that a color. Player active is the exact same name, so we don't need to have to change up how this is worded. Player still equals a player active because now that class is being referenced to. So we should be good aside from a few more colors. Let's see, we have white. Alright, that's the only issue. But of course, this is our main function. Utils gets imported by everything. So we'll just import utils. And then where we have white right here, just say utils.white. And we have the color situation sorted out. So let's run this, make sure it still works exactly how it used to. Okay, we still shoot, that's fine. We move around, letters spawn inside of our blue box. Everything seems to be working exactly the way it was. Except now what's nice is that we don't have this gigantic file. We have pretty much a very simple file where this is just the main file. This is all it does, is it imports other stuff and then runs functions inside of its main loop, such as player.update, in which case it just updates the player. So we've rearranged stuff more so the way we want it. Now let's add another file to handle the enemy. So we're going to go new Python file. What's this one going to be called? I'm going to call this a basic enemy. So what's a basic enemy? Well, we're going to define it as a class again. Class, we'll call this one just enemy. I'm still missing stuff here. Class enemy, define init self, and it auto completes that for me. And then what is a basic enemy? Well, basic enemy needs some structure. So let's take a look. What do we usually do for our things? We go self.image equals a pygame.surface. And I think we'll make this one smaller than our player, so it'll be 50-50. Self.rect equals self.image.getRect. And then we have the rectangle associated to it. Of course, we have this Pygame problem. So, whoops. Don't want breakpoints, and I don't want that minimized. So we just do what we did with the other ones, import Pygame. Now, it could be said that it's bad that we're importing Pygame, but with so many different modules, but it's not really, since there's no cross imports. It's not like Pygame is importing any of these, in which case, if that was the case, it'd be bad. It's only, imports are only really become super troublesome if two things import each other. For example, since everything is importing utilities, we cannot allow anything to import, or we can't import anything into utilities that will be using it. For example, main uses utilities. generic player uses utilities. If utilities import either of those two, that's when we get an issue. So let's see what else we have. Well, self.image.fill. We know this is going to be utils.red, and we'll just make sure we import red. So import utils. Now we have access to the utility library, which has all of our colors. And our enemy is going to need a few more things. So in order to track our player, it's going to take a bit more programming. So let's see, how do we want to do that? Well, our bullets pretty much do exactly what we want to do currently. So let's look at getTarget for a moment. We get the difference in the X and Y position, and then we normalize that vector just by creating the number of frames over the speed. This way it doesn't move faster the further away it is, or the closer it is, it moves slower. It moves at a steady rate. And then of course we actually move it, and then this stuff was just to get the real position and then do the offset. But for the most part, this code is exactly the same. The only difference is our target is no longer the cursor. It's the player. So what I'm actually going to do is, let's copy this, because we can use this again for our basic enemy. So if we do something, let's define another function inside this enemy, define move toward player. How would I say that shorter? Stalk player. In which case this is going to take a player as the object. It wants a player object, so we know what we're stalking, basically. And in here it's going to do nearly identical to the same thing that we did in the previous one. Except instead of the difference will simply be player.rect.x plus player.rect.width over 2. And then this is going to get the center of the X position on the player. And then that's of course going to take the centered of this object, which is the enemy. This actually isn't the center. I've been doing subtractions and I think that's wrong this entire time. Because if I'm looking for the center, then it's the X, which is the leftmost corner, plus half of the width. I could have been doing that wrong. I thought I was doing it right though. The X difference from the center to the center. Yeah, I definitely should be adding this. Anyway, aside from mistakes that I've been making this whole time, player.rect.y plus player.rect.height over 2. And this of course gets the center on the Y angle of the same thing. And again, to get the center I should be using plus. Very strange. Magnitude is math, square root, self.speed. We have a couple values that we need. We don't need the real travels because we don't really care about them. So I'm just going to get rid of them because they're not needed for this. And before we forget, we need to import math so that we can use math.square-root. And let's see, xmove equals the distance it is. We need to define self.speed. And then we'll set this equal to, I don't know, 5? What was our player's speed is a good question. Because we don't want this thing moving faster than the player, otherwise, well, maybe more advanced enemies will move faster than the player, but generically we want to be able to outrun them. Player's speed is 5, so I'm going to set these to 3 instead, just so it's working out. It's actually not going to be the x different, but the self.xmove, and same for this one, self.ymove. And that's because stock player is going to retarget every time, every frame. We might make it, retarget every other frame or every couple frames if it ever begins to lag, but I don't think this program is going to become big enough for that to really become an issue. So I believe that this should work the way it is. We just have to call stock player in something. And let's define another function, define update. This takes a player. And this calls stock player, and then whatever player is passed into it. self.stockPlayer, just because we have to define that that function is part of our class. And I think this should be everything. It might complain about some of these being called if they're used elsewhere. Maybe not. Self.xMove, ymove. Those aren't actually used in any other function, and I don't believe they ever will be. So they don't need to be self values. They can just stay as local. I do have to make sure they're matched though, because these are the only ones that are actually being affected globally. The rest of this stuff is all happening in this function and will only ever need to be accessed in this function. So it doesn't really need to have the self parameter name. That's only for things that need to be accessed everywhere. So we have our basic enemy. Let's go back to the main and import it. So from generic player, import player active. I'm going to say from basic enemy, import enemy. And now we have access to the enemy class that we just made. So much like how our player works, we can create some enemies. So let's create two, just like my example. Enemy1 equals an enemy. Enemy2 equals an enemy. Enemy. And I actually want to change something. Enemy2.speed is going to equal 1, just so that we can tell them apart. Enemy2 will be much slower than Enemy1, because Enemy1 speed will be 3 by default. Enemy2, I'm going to set it to 1. So we have our two enemies. I believe we just have to draw them now. So here we'll actually draw them, much like we do the player. So enemy1 dot update, give it the game window, and give it a player. Enemy2 dot update, give it a game window, give it the player. Spell game window with the proper capitalization. And of course, we don't have the enemy set up to take 2 arguments yet, so it's just throwing a simple error at us. Update takes the game window, so game window and a player. So we're going to stock the player, and then we're going to draw ourselves. And how do we draw ourselves? Game window.blit, self.image, self.rect. And there we go. Now we're drawing ourselves. And we are stalking the player, which means we should be following him. And I think that this should work the way it is. It might not. Of course, that one isn't moving at all. I wonder why. Maybe 1 movement speed it's not allowed to move. But this one is indeed following us. And it feels like he's not following us at a flat speed. It feels like he's still kind of jumping a little bit, depending if he moves at an angle or not. He moves much faster to the top left. That's rather awkward, to be honest. Of course, our bullets aren't going to do anything in this example because we haven't set up collision. His movement is definitely not perfect, but it's kind of jumpy. I think that's kind of funny. You know, you think you're about to get away, and then he starts getting faster, running toward you. And then he slows down sometimes as you get away, like, ha ha ha, you're so slow. And then he eventually gets you. But anyway, it works for now. He follows us. I'm not going to make their AI too complicated. I could, of course, just make them move in straight lines and then we dodge them. But we might come back to it later. I'm not entirely sure yet. It's possible that we don't even update it every frame. But for now, as you can see, what I'm trying to show is that all of these different classes are working even though they're not in the same file. So our main file doesn't have to associate itself. It can be a nice small main file that just runs basically scripts from everything else. For example, our actual main loop, what does it really do? So we're filling it here. This is where we're clearing the screen. We're just checking if our mouse is clicked, in which case we shoot, and then we're calling 3 update functions, and that's our entire game. And then of course we're updating the screen and ticking the clock. But basically, this is our entire game right here. 3 update functions. And we're able to run around the map, shoot a bunch of things, and have bullets spawn inside of our player object. That's quite a lot for a few functions. It makes it simple as well. because then when we ever get errors, crashes in the console here, it'll tell us that it's one of these basically. Is we called one of these and then those called something else, something happened, and then we know, a general idea on what's happening. Normally it does tell you the line number anyway, but keeping it organized so that these are all in different classes is just going to make it easier to find what we're looking for. Anyway, this can be end of the 6th video since it's already at /over the time that I'd like. Next time we're going to focus solely on collision just to get this looking more like the example I had, where if I can find it, I'll show it again just for fun. As you can see, we can shoot them and have them destroy themselves, and we can also get hit by them and have them, well, destroy both of us as it would turn out, but my player still lives for this example. So anyway, thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time.